What is up? It's Vic, your Hunter, and today we're going to talk about the heart rate accuracy performance for the new Whoop 5.0, specifically the Whoop MG version of the 5.0. I do think they're the same. I do think that both 5.0 as well as the MG has the same sensor, and I also do think that it's the same sensor as the 4.0 with maybe a couple of minor tweaks with processing time as well as maybe algorithm adjustments to make it a little bit better. But we're going to look at it in three main phases, and this is not polished and prepped. I have had the data compiled for a while. I did 15 different workouts across testing it on the wrist, testing it steady state on the wrist, testing it steady state on the bicep, and testing it higher intensity interval training, CrossFit, whatever you want to call it, on the bicep as well. And so we're going to dive into all the stats. I'll share one little tidbit before we get started as to why we're just jumping in, because I want to get the content out and it's not going to be as polished, because I have a new little Buster Brown. This is Bailey. Bailey is easy. Bailey is a good whippersnapper, but she's a young whippersnapper, and she takes a lot of time and attention. So with that, let's dive into the charts. We're going to look at it specifically, look at the heart rate graphs compared to a chest strap. I've been using the Garmin HRM 200 chest strap compared to the Whoop 5.0. We're going to look at it first on the wrist and some stats there, and we're going to look at it on the bicep and different modalities, and we're going to go from there. So we're going to look at charts, and then we're going to look at correlation graphs and just talk about it in general. So all right, so what you see is the heart rate graph on the wrist. So we're going to look at a series of heart rate graphs on the wrist and talk about what we see. We see here, obviously, in the lifting parts, it did not capture it. And then in the higher intensity interval parts, it captured it somewhat, but that is actually a low steady state, probably more of a lifting day. We see on a second workout, it actually missed that whole boat because it was down at the bottom, whereas the other graph was at the top. And then you have the lifting portion where it did not capture it. And then you have the more intense, upwards of 160 beats per minute, where it did actually okay. It overestimated, obviously, in that method. Here's another CrossFit workout, which had some lifting in the beginning where it did not catch the peaks. It just sort of hovered in the middle. And then in the more intense period of time, it actually followed just all over the place. So for me, let me see if that's the last one. Nope, this is the last one. We see in the beginning off there. We see in the intervals, like specific intervals at higher intensity of 160, it is not quite capturing the full hills. I would say in general, this is not bad. If you look on the back half, we just had some after work. It did not quite stay, but it's not terrible. Okay, so then the last one we're going to look at is more of a monostructural on the wrist. So here I just did rowing up to for a period of time. I did a 7K row, and then I did this basic assault bike on the backside, just keeping my heart rate at a relatively meager pace just for zone 2 tracking. But you can see it had great inaccuracy at different points in the beginning. But in general, it actually was okay in a monostructural environment. So this was rowing, so it did have wrist flex or wrist gripping in there. And then in the last part, with specifically the assault bike portion, I was going at a super snail's pace, just keeping my heart rate at 120. So it's okay for monostructural, although there are high level inaccuracies. So for me, it's just not what I would want to base my data on. It can do some monostructural. I don't think it does a great job with higher intensity intervals, and I think it does a terrible job with weightlifting. So that's my summation for why I would not rely on it in the wrist, and why I would not trust that, or I did not do a correlation comparison because it's too far off. So now we're going to look at on the bicep and compare it on the bicep first for monostructural, for typically rowing, but just more monostructural work on the bicep. So these are for the bicep itself. So here we see great deal of accuracy on the bicep. You have a couple of weird blips, but overall great accuracy. Again, some erroneous thing in the beginning. I don't know what that was, and either way, it kept up with the intervals, and these were higher intervals. This was a more intense interval rowing session, which, peaked out my heart rate, in the 160s, and then some slow, steady work on the back half. Did great there. Here's a half marathon row. So just long time domain. Did great there. I mean, obviously, if we were to analyze some of these things, maybe there'd be some minor inaccuracies, but it's not going to be that far off. It's just looking great all around. So here's the correlation graph for steady state, specifically rowing, with some assault bike mixed into some of those workouts. We see a high deal of correlation at 0.96. We see, a good number of data points, but we see when it does get inaccurate, for some reason it goes a little bit low, but in the higher heart rate zones, it's more black, meaning there's more overlap and more correlated dots. So I would say it's 100% reliable within relative terms for steady state workouts on the bicep. And now we're going to look at the true CrossFit workouts, whether it's lifting or whether it's higher intensity intervals or higher intensity interval training or CrossFit. How does it keep up on the biceps? So these are all bicep graphs, and we're going to see the correlation between the Whoop 5.0 or the Whoop MG and the chest strap at the end. So here's a longer time domain, a lot of work, some work in the beginning, some work in the middle. That was the lifting portion, and then some higher-ish intensity. So I think it peaked out at like 150. So fair, but it's obviously keeping within the graph. Here, keeping within the graph. So a lot of pre-work, a lot of different lifting, and then higher intensity interval in the back half up to 160, kept up just fine. Here, for whatever reason, it cut off the first part. Oh, because I didn't start the tracking. But it did fine. I think for it got screwed up in the overlap. So here's another high intensity interval training session. So 160, getting upwards of 170. And it looks like it kept up in a great overlap for the most part from an optical sensor that's worn on the wrist. So here's some lifting. You can see it basically is just keeping up with the lifts off the bicep. So that's great. So a lot of times it's going to have some lag on the bicep when you're doing a lift because your heart rate gets compressed when you're doing heavier exertions. Here was something off. I don't know what this was or why this was off in that intense portion. I don't remember there being any conflict, but this was upwards of 170 plus beats per minute. So this was a much higher intensity session, and it did sort of have some faults. And we're going to see that in the correlation as it's obviously tied in. Here's that segment of looking at it more closely in the faults that it had. Here's a higher intensity bunch of like concrete intervals. I think there were 10 of them specifically, as well as some interval work on the back half, and it kept up just fine. So all that looks great. Here, for some reason, I walked away from the phone, which was transmitting the heart rate, and then for whatever reason, it did not pick back up. So be aware that if you are tracking it on another app and you're using the broadcast heart rate, that if you walk away, sometimes it just doesn't catch back on. I didn't have that problem in other instances. So you can see the whole back half of the workout didn't get caught, but we do have the front half of the workout, which was the really painful part. So the painful part went up to almost 180 beats a minute, and you can see that it sort of did pretty well. It didn't quite get to those peaks. It looks like it topped out at a 160. Nope, I apologize. It went over. The Whoop is the one that's over correcting here, so higher than normal. And that was the error there. So here the Whoop is the purple, and on the purple, keeping up the same but not going over. And then in here, we have the chest. That's the chest strap in purple. So it is overestimating, at least on this one workout. Sorry for bouncing all around. It went over. Here's another longer time domain interval portion. That's 160, almost upwards of 170. It looked like it did pretty as awesome as you'd want. Peaks in the beginning, warm up, and the longer time domain intervals. And then here's the correlation graph. So this was like a lot of data. It's like 22,000 data points. What do we see here? It's got a good correlation on the bicep for higher intensity interval training as well as lifting. But if it's going to estimate anything, it's going to overestimate. So it's going to overestimate in minor form. I would say that 0.95, 0.9489 is trustworthy for what you would want it to be. I just say, they need to connect to a chest strap. That's the frustrating part. So in summary, if I look at what do I think of the Whoop 5.0 MG, it's relatively the same sensor. They did say that they updated how fast it processes each heart rate tracking and some technical term for it. So the processing speed is faster. So it is getting a little bit more accurate there, as well as updates to the algorithm a little more accurate, but it's the same physical hardware. So I'm not loving it as far as a solution at all on the wrist. I don't think you should wear it on the wrist. I don't think if you want to get accurate data for your strain calculation, you should use it on the wrist, especially if you're doing anything with wrist flex. I would just bite the bullet and get some other form of connecting it to your body somewhere else. The bicep band being the easiest. On the bicep band with the monostructural workouts, it was nearly flawless. Obviously, the tight correlation, especially in the higher heart rate zones. And then when you're doing lifting and higher intensity interval training, we still do have a high level of correlation, a high level of similarities. And I think it's trustworthy enough. Although they still need to correct that final thing. And I do think there's rumors about them having some connection to a chest strap. So I think there's a possibility that that will happen. Some sort of external heart rate sensor. I think it'll happen. They'll probably brand it. They'll control it. It'll be like Apple where you can't use somebody else's stuff. And so there we have it. So that's my thoughts on the Whoop 5.0 accuracy, Whoop MG accuracy on the wrist, on the bicep for monostructural, and on the bicep for lifting and higher intensity interval training. It's a Figure Hunter. Thanks so much for watching.